Great to have you along for the ride. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Really glad to have this man on. He's an author. He's an historian. He's got a brand new book out. It's called Our Flag Was Still There, the Star-Spangled Banner that survived the British in 200 years, and the Armistead family who saved it. It's Tom McMillan. Tom, how are you? Good to see you.
Joe, great. Great to be here.
You know, I'm a guy who still gets welled up when I see the flag and I hear the national anthem, and I know what it symbolizes, and freedom and liberty in the greatest land on the planet. It's been under attack for a while now, and it always seems to be a left-leaning administration, whether it's Jimmy Carter or the more modern-day ones, that seem to take away nationalism and understand what that flag is all about. I haven't read your book yet. Can't wait to do so. I get welled up, as I said. I'm guessing you probably really enjoy seeing the flag wave as well. Why do we have this flag? Why is it a flag that looks like it does? Is there a lot to that?
There's a lot to it. And Joe, I'm a pretty good student of history. And as I dug into this, I was surprised and almost embarrassed by how little I knew.
Wow.
We kind of know a little bit of this story. Key saw the flag and they went at Fort McHenry and gave the national anthem, and that is it. And there's so much more to it. And the idea kind of came, I would go to the Smithsonian, and they still have the flag 209 years later. It's so thin.
The original one.
Yes, this flag still exists.
Wow.
The story is about its journey from Fort McHenry in 1814 to the Smithsonian today. You can go and visit it, but as great a job as they do, I'm convinced that even most who go to visit don't know that whole story and why it survives. And this is one of the most iconic pieces of American history. Our anthem is about a flag. This is the singular flag that it's about. All those years old, tattered and torn. But when I was talking to one of the conservators at the Smithsonian, when they were doing the latest rehab project, and they had to do a lot of work on it, she said, we viewed it as a metaphor for the country. It's tattered and it's torn, but it still survives.
Yeah.
And the flag survives as the country survives. And that's kind of the story that motivated them when they were working on it, and motivated me to tell this story, because I'm convinced that most people don't know the backstory of that flag that got there.
Well, if you're a historian and an author and you didn't know, you know darn well the talk show host doesn't know. So this is going to be a fun conversation. Go to authortommcmillan.com, and his last name is McMillan. Go there and go check out this. But now, can you get it elsewhere as well? Amazon, other places?
Oh yes, Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It's in some bookstores already. It just came out last week. But Amazon and Barnes and Noble are the prime places to order it.
The name of the book is Our Flag Was Still There, and then a long subtitle as well, and we'll get into that more in a little while. Is this the original flag? Was it actually sewn by Betsy Ross?
No, that's another of the myths that I...
Is that a wives' tale? I mean, is that not true?
No, it's not true at all. This is the flag. The battle was in 1814. It was ordered in 1813 by George Armistead, who was the commander at Fort McHenry. And the war wasn't going well for the Americans back then. And he wanted a flag so large the British couldn't help but see it from a distance. So that he ordered it. It was 30 feet high by 42 feet wide.
Wow.
And a local Baltimore seamstress and flag maker named Mary Pickerskill, whose name does not flow off the tongue like Betsy Ross, but Mary and her daughter and her nieces and some other, about 7 ladies, got together. It took them 6 weeks. They made 2 flags. They made a smaller storm flag. Each fort had that as well. The storm flag would fly during inclement conditions. But so this flag flew over Fort McHenry for a full year before the battle. And the amazing thing to me, like I was trying to, why does it still survive?
Yeah.
It's because Armistead, after the battle, about a year or two, took it down off the flagpole and took it home as a souvenir.
Oh, wow.
And it remained in the private possession of his family for 90 years until his grandson donated to the Smithsonian in 1907. So that's why it still exists. Because, Joe, I think history, a lot through history, in the immediate moment, people don't always grasp the importance of things. The war was still going on. It's only sometimes years or decades later you look back. And you realize, wow, this is an iconic item of American patriotism. So thankfully that family kept it, but they kept it mostly as their father and grandfather's heirloom. And it was only over time that we realized, wow, this is the actual flag that flew over Fort McHenry, and Key wrote the song of it. So it's tied totally to our national anthem.
It is author and historian Tom McMillan. Go to authortommcmillan.com. Get his book. It's called Our Flag Was Still There, the Star-Spangled Banner that survived the British in 200 years and the Armistead family who saved it. What's interesting about this, most people think the American Revolution happened, and on July 4th, 1776, we won, and we all cracked open the champagne. That, of course, isn't what happened. We didn't even have the Constitution ratified until 1787. The War of 1812, was that the British trying to take back what we claim to be independently ours? Did they come back to say, well, wait a second, this isn't over? Was it sort of an extension, or was it a completely different thing?
It wasn't. It was a completely different thing. There was still some tension, but basically, they were trying to bully us. We were a young power, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's only 36 years after the declaration, but there was a war going on over in Europe between England and France. 20 years for control of the continent, and the British. It was a battle of attrition. They needed more soldiers, and they would board American ships and say, these Americans are really British, and they would force American sailors into service in the British Navy.
Oh, wow.
They tried to cut off our trade with France. So we were offended by this affront to our sovereignty. So President Madison declared war in 1812. We declared war on them. It wasn't as good military position or decision, but I think they didn't know what to do. And for a while, they bit off more than they could chew. But in the American way, we figured it out. And the war didn't go well. The war actually lasted 3 years. Didn't go well for the first few years. But the American military learned how to fight. And Fort McHenry was one of the key battles. There were 3 or 4 in 1814-15 that did it. And the British basically pulled back. But it had that battle and war ended differently, the history of our country would be completely different. And we don't know much about that war, so we don't really focus on it.
I saw somebody do a man in the street the other day, and I forget who it was. It was somebody that we would know the name of, who was asking people when was the War of 1812, who didn't seem to understand or know when the war happened, and also who was it against, and people had no clue whatsoever. They were just saying different European countries didn't involve us at all. So that historically has kind of been forgotten. I'm glad that you're bringing it back to light with the story of the flag. Tell me about the material that was used in this flag. Would it be like what we use today for clothing or for flags, or was it completely different? And when they rehabilitate it, Tom, do they rehabilitate it with similar material, or are they using modern material to restore it?
Yeah, it was English wool bunting. Ironically, the wool was ordered from England.
Wow.
And again, 30 feet by 42 feet. These
Huge.
women, it took them 6 weeks. After a while, it got so big they had to drag it from Mary Pickersgill's house to a local brewery and spread it out on the floor to work on it there and sewing the stars in with special techniques. But what's happened over the years, one of the amazing stories is it's 8 feet shorter now than it used to be, Joe. If you go to the Smith 30 by 34 and it's jagged, it's not battle damage. And the conservators told me we would view this as sacrilegious today, but it was commonplace back then. The Armistead ladies would cut off snippets of the flag and give them as souvenirs to battle veterans, dignitaries. Again, we're aghast at that today, but that's what they did back then. Yeah. So they, over time, cut 8 feet of the flag away. Since then, they've had to work on it. There were major rehab projects in 1914, and again, really one in the early 2000s. They spent 8 years working on it. They had to take stitches out of the flag, and very gingerly, I have a photo of the flag from the year 2000 with ladies just suspended in machines over the flag because you can't touch it. It's so thin and frail. But they did this great work. And what exists is the actual, they didn't replace anything, but they have to just deal with it. It was so weak that they have to make sure after 209 years, you can imagine the condition it might be in. And yet, when you look at it, it's still amazingly strong and it's bright. And I think when you go around that corner of the Smithsonian, it's a really darkened chamber. It's really everybody, even the school kids, get silent. And military veterans, you can talk about welling up in their eyes.
I'll bet.
Feel it's almost like it's on an altar. It's if every American should go there. If you go to this D.C., go to the Smithsonian, go to see the Star-Spangled Banner. It's really a special moment.
It is, again, author Tom McMillan. Go get his book. It's called Our Flag Was Still There. It's the story of this flag that was flying over Fort McHenry, right?
Yes.
During the War of 1812. What's amazing to me is that the colors are the colors because of the Union Jack, right? We took the red, white, and blue from England, did we not?
There are all sorts of theories. That seems to be the most likely theory. In fact, I speculated in the book that when Key and the people out on the boat, he was on a boat in the harbor during the battle. Imagine what perspective that would be. You're behind the British ships, and they bombed Fort McHenry for 25 hours.
Wow.
1,500 bombs. But they're looking to see which flag at the next morning, when it's misty and rainy, was flying over the fort. Who won the battle? And you're right, the British flag is red, white, and blue as well. But they were finally able to make out the stars and stripes with our flag. And the other thing, Joe, in the cover of the book, because people on social media have said that's not a legal flag. It violates the flag code. It had 15 stars and 15 stripes.
I was just
We
about to ask
respected
you how many stars and stripes were on it. I didn't know if it was the colonial flag, but I thought there were more states than the original 13, so it was 15.
15 stars and 15 stripes.
I wonder
Back we
why.
were a young country. We thought that we were going to add one star and one stripe for each state. It was
Oh.
only an 18. Imagine what our flag would look like
It'd
today
be
if we kept that up.
humongous. Yeah, it would be
Yeah.
crazy.
So it wasn't until 1818 that Congress decided, okay, 13 stripes for the original colonies and a star for each new flag. So when people look at this flag, it looks a little different. And some people are, well, where did that come from? Because they just don't know the story. But that's the story behind. The first line of the book is, this is the story behind the story of the most famous flag in U.S. history.
And what was the lady's name again?
Who made it? Mary Pickersgill.
I pick her skill is it's actually she picked her skill and she made the flag. I think that's kind of you make all sorts of stories about that. Where did Betsy Ross come from? Did she do the original colonial flag?
She was in Philadelphia. She was a flag maker in Philadelphia, and that is the myth, the rumor. There are always people have questioned that.
So we don't even know.
Was it a descendant? She made flags. I mean, she certainly made flags. Did she make the very first flag? A grandson said that. It became a great story. We love great stories. So you don't really know. I only got into that just a little bit, but I did want to make the case because I went to the Smithsonian. I live in Pittsburgh. So I went to the Smithsonian about 4 hours away numerous times during this research. And there are always school groups there. And it would infuriate me inside when I would hear the teacher or the moderator say, go inside and see the Betsy Ross flag, because that's what everyone thinks. So part of this is, I don't know, you almost sound arrogant when you say correcting history, but we accept myths because they're such great stories and we don't really look into them. So there's some things I think I'm very proud that the book maybe will correct, that you have a slightly different view and get the full story of why it happened, why the anthem happened, and why it's so incredible that it exists today.
Well, I think our duty is, and I think it sounds like you agree, is to correct history. I remember I interviewed Dr. Mudd's great-grandson back in 1996. He was, I think, 103 years old, something like that. And I sat down with him, and I was amazed by the story of Dr. Mudd, who gave John Wilkes Booth, some health care when he jumped out the window and broke his leg. And since then, your name is Mudd because Dr. Mudd was dragged through the mud, quite literally, after he helped this guy. Why would you ever give aid to the guy that just shot Lincoln? And just finding out the history of that, I mean, what I learned in school was nothing like what the real story was. And I think it is your job as a historian and my job as somebody who tries to tell the truth to give the right answers. So I'm glad that you did this because I never heard of Pickersgill. I certainly know her now, and my viewers and listeners will find out as well. Have you got an opinion, Tom, on the third stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner? I think I know what it means because that was just an insult of the day that you would call somebody like a piece of garbage or a piece of blank, and that was calling them slaves and something else, underlings or whatever it was. What is that a racist stanza or not?
I get into the anthem a little bit. There have been books written on the anthem. I wanted to make sure that this was a book more about the flag.
Yes.
But you can't write about it's named the Star-Spangled Banner because of the anthem. The one thing I like to point out to people is a lot of folks have not read and don't even know there are 4 verses.
Yes.
We only sing the first verse. People think that's the anthem. If you sit down and read all 4 verses, you can see what Key was doing. He never set out to write a national anthem. That wasn't his. He didn't say, I'm going to write a national anthem someday. He witnessed this battle from the water, and it's his feelings about the battle sequentially. You can tell the writing sequentially. Actually, he doesn't. The first verse ends in a question mark, and people always say, "What's it?" It's because the first verse he's saying, for a while, I didn't know who won the battle. That's why it ends with a question mark. It's not until the second verse that he declares victory, and it's an exclamation point. And the third verse, a lot of us think there are all sorts of different interpretations. And Key didn't do us any favors. He never wrote about why he wrote what he wrote. He never explained it. All we have are the lyrics. But I think a lot of historians, but the third verse is angry at the British. The British were the enemy. We were fighting them for the second time in 36 years. And there was a lot of venom toward them. And then the fourth verse, he wraps it up, and he also uses "In God We Trust." He kind of created the motto there. He did it for the first time. So I think to really assess the anthem, you can't just read a singular verse. You have to read
Right.
all four of them to see and understand the history of the war. I think a lot of folks who criticize it don't realize. They say, "Why is it so military?" He was writing about a battle. Again, he wasn't trying to write an anthem. It took 117. Was it in 1931? 117 years later
Can you
that it
imagine?
became the anthem. So it was long after he had died. But if you look it up, Google it and look up all four, or read this book and read all four verses, you'll see that he's writing sequentially about his experiences during the battle. That
Right.
was his purpose. I think he would be stunned if he knew this was the national anthem.
Very, very well explained. I've had other historians on, and they say that it was a general insult of the day. And there were still some young Americans, some Americans in this young land, who would switch sides and go enslave themselves to the British. And it wasn't about, African slaves. It wasn't about the slave trade. It was about calling somebody the worst name you could possibly call them. And it didn't have anything to do with race at all. And I think it's a pretty good explanation. You're the first person who told me that he wrote it sequentially as he was viewing the war. That is major information. And I appreciate you telling us that. He's an author. He's an historian. The book is called Our Flag Was Still There, the Star-Spangled Banner that survived the British in 200 years, and the Armistead family who saved it. His name is Tom McMillan. Tom, one last thing on this. Any thoughts? We talked about this briefly before we started today, that it's a vast minority that always attack the flag or want to step on the flag or burn the flag. Any thoughts as a historian as you watch that? Did this happen through our history in this country, that people always, took out their anger on that symbol?
I think people have taken out their anger on the symbol since I'm researching a book now on the Declaration in 1776. We've had these divides forever. It's part of America. We have free speech.
Yes.
That's what's happened. There are always, there's so much more publicity now because of social media, but
Right.
we've always had these throughout our history. And I think going back to what the lady from the Smithsonian said about it's about survival. And this flag has survived as the country survives. We overcome these challenges. We already always have. And when I look at that flag, this particular flag, this individual flag, that's what I think 209 years later
It's
that
amazing.
it has survived. And all these people over 2 centuries who obviously didn't know each other, they all chipped in, from George Armistead, who thought of it and defended it, Mary Pickersgill, who made it, and all the people since then, his grandson who donated it, all the people at the Smithsonian who for 100 years have worked on it, the major project in 2008. And now they're convinced that it will last a long time.
I love it. I trust that it will. There's a reason why that flag still survives. I'm glad you wrote about it. The name of the book is Our Flag Was Still There. His name is Tom McMillan. Tom, let's do it again soon. I appreciate you stopping by.
Would love to, Joe. Thank you so much.
All right, we're back after this. Stay right here.